Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about DORA compliance. And DORA is another regulation that's coming out of the EU. If you're tracking over the last, year or so, there's been several, a barrage of different regulations coming out around security, AI, and privacy. For example, me and Phil have already done one on EU AI Act. We did NIST 2, which is another security regulation. Now we're talking about DORA. So this is really exciting. We think there's a lot happening in the world right now, especially out of the EU. And today we're going to talk you through everything that you need to be compliant with DORA and give you a good executive summary so you walk out feeling very educated. Just a little bit of background on Phil and I and why we think we're good folks to be doing this. So we have for years now, Phil and I have done kind of regulatory analysis in the security and privacy space, dating back at least to GDPR when it comes to the EU, where we read the whole act, mark it up, and then do presentations and talks and webinars like this, just talking about how the act is applicable to you and how you can become compliant with it. So this is just the latest in our series in doing that. So if you haven't seen those other series, you can check out YouTube and find those videos and search for Risk 360 and whatever framework you want. You can find that. So myself, just in the way of quick introduction, I'm Christian Hyatt, and CEO and co-founder of Risk 360. I help lead the company and also do analysis like this. Phil, want to do a quick intro?
Phil Bredney. I'm director of research here. Spend a lot of time just coming through all these new regulations, helping companies make plans to become compliant.
If you're not familiar with who Risk 360 is and kind of our ecosystem, just so you know who's talking to you, kind of have two sides of our business. We have a compliance side of our business where we help issue certifications, the alphabet soup of different acronyms. We're probably doing something around that. This in the security, privacy, or AI space. Our specialty is helping organizations with multiple frameworks. So if you're just burdened with compliance, you're doing, 5, 10, 15 different regulatory or compliance frameworks, getting certifications, and you're trying to find efficiencies. We're really good at harmonizing those. We do consulting services around that, but we also have a GRC platform that helps with that. And on the other side of the house, we also help organizations build cybersecurity programs, manage risk. We offer virtual CISO services for organizations who want to outsource that. We have a really talented offensive security team. We help GRC transformations. So bottom line is we're not just researchers. We're also helping organizations build these programs and apply them tactically. So I think that helps us build a unique perspective in terms of as we read these regulations and think through how they might be applicable to organizations. I think over the last 10 years or so, we've helped a couple thousand organizations or done a couple thousand engagements related to this. So just a wealth of experience. And we'll try to bring some of those stories today for you guys. So that's enough of us. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So here's kind of our roadmap. First, we're going to try to give you some context. We'll talk about DORA, how we got here, what the regulatory process in the EU looks like. We'll talk about its applicability and whether you need to be worried about it or not, who it's targeted towards. Then we'll dive into a structural overview of DORA, of the regulation itself and the many requirements, and we'll try to put that in human readable format for you. Then we'll go through a compliance roadmap. So this is our standard path to compliance, and we'll talk about implementing a compliance program to comply with DORA. And then also, if you need to prove compliance to folks, what are your options? And then we'll link you to a bunch of free resources. We marked up the regulation itself. So if you want to download our markup, of course, you can get a copy of this video if you want to share it with people who it might be applicable to, and just a written executive summary of the content that we'll talk about today. So that's what we'll go. Let's dive right into how we got here. So Phil, give us the background when it comes to DORA. Where are we at in the process? How did we wind up here?
DORA, really, it came about because several supervisory authorities, in the financial sector, in various regulators, they recognize that there's, of course, in today's society, so much technological dependence for banking companies, other financial entities, and of course, it's critical for EU citizens, the world at large, that these services ultimately be available. So together, these regulators put out a call that, hey, this is something we need a unified approach to guide companies on what's important, what they need to do to manage risk, and ultimately, they call it operational resilience, but being able to continue services no matter who's attacking, what's down, like finding a way to continue services.
One thing I'll add just for context for people, I always like to compare like the US, 'cause that's primarily where we do business with how the EU does it. If you look in in the US, there is some regulatory action when it comes to security and privacy. You see it largely at the state level. Maybe if you're doing federal contracting, there's some requirements there, but not the same type of regulatory activity you see in the EU. Most of us here in the US is B2B compliance. So like you're required via contract, or some of your big customers are making you do different security and compliance requirements. Whereas in the EU, what we have seen, starting with GDPR, looking at NIST 2 and DORA and others, EU AI Act, they take I would say, a heavier handed, centralized approach to governing that stuff. So the pattern I'm seeing, there's some sector nuances. So like NIS2 is the kind of critical infrastructure. DORA is looking at financial services. EUA Act had their applicability. Then they allow the EU as the regulatory authority submits these directives or regulations. Then the EU member states spin up regulatory authorities, or the banking sector has a regulatory authority, and then they go regulate across the EU. So just a slightly kind of two sides of the same coin, just handled a little bit differently. So if you're from the US, you're not familiar with how the EU is doing it, you can kind of think of it as just a different enforcement mechanism, but kind of similar result. So that's how we got here. Oh, important to note, as of this recording, this came out and is in full force January 17th, 2025. So now it is in force. It's through the regulatory process. Talk a little bit, I hinted to it, but Phil, talk to us, like, who should be thinking about this? How is DORA in terms of applicability?
So it is a financial sector regulation. So obviously, banks and credit institutions are at the top. But as you can see, kind of a wide variety, including investments, insurance, some crypto service providers, trading platforms are all within the scope, as well as ICT, which is information and communication technology, third-party service providers. So if you're providing a lot of services to this industry, you're directly called within the scope of DORA.
That's where like a lot of B2B technology companies, I think, get pulled into this. Obviously, DORA is directly applicable mostly to financial organizations, but in all likelihood, if you're a technology company, like a significant industry vertical that you serve is financial organizations. So you're a third party to a financial organization, so there'll likely be some impact, whether in a security questionnaire or a contract or something. You'll probably be pulled into that even though you're not directly applicable. We talked about that's the context. That's where it's at in the regulatory process. It's officially out. If you're financial services or you're supporting financial services, it's largely applicable to you. So you need to be paying attention if you're serving financial services in the EU. Now let's dive into structure. So just so everyone knows, what we did is we read the full text of the regulation itself. We do have that markup available. So if you're watching this video, look in the comments, or you can look in your email inbox if that's how you requested this, and you can get a copy of our markup of that legislation itself. Phil has done the courtesy of pulling out the high points chapter by chapter and telling us kind of like where should we be zooming in at, what's the general structure. So Phil, could you just kind of walk us through the structure?
Like every EU act or regulation, it begins with recitals, which one, they start off talking about a lot of the context around why this act is being enacted. And then it also moves into some explanation behind specific provisions within the act itself. So in our markup, we try to highlight the most significant areas, but there is always a lot of good information in the recitals. And you immediately move into the overview and definitions. Then chapter 2 is really where you get into what the key requirements are. I'll talk about these more in a few minutes, but the first requirement is a risk management program for ICT. Chapter 3 covers incident management, so specific rules for this sector. Chapter 4, something else we'll talk a lot about, they call it digital operational resilience testing. That's all of your technical scans, and there's also this concept of threat-led penetration testing that's here in the law as well.
Yeah, and I'll foreshadow. We're kind of moving through this quickly on purpose, but these sections in particular, we'll dive into deeper here in a moment, and also we'll close out by talking about the implementation process, how you can comply with this. And our assumption generally is you probably have some kind of security program already, and you need to integrate DORA into that existing ecosystem. So we'll pull out a matching between what you might already be doing or need to do and what these requirements are. So we'll dive into these sections in a little bit more, but those are the first 4 chapters. So moving into chapter 5.
So chapter 5, that's really the last pillar, which is third-party risks. So I'll talk through a lot of key requirements in the supply chain. From there, it's more implementation, administrative type things. So there's some information on how threat intelligence should be shared, who's given the authority to collect that, and then chapters 7 through 9 are really about just who the authorities are and how this is going to be ultimately passed into law and when it becomes effective.
So just for y'all's shortcut, if you want to download our markup, you can basically read chapters 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. Those are the heart of the things you need to do, which we'll pull out here in a minute. And then if you get into chapter, I would say 7, that's kind of the enforcement component. Like, who are the regulatory authorities? How do you prove compliance? What do you need to do? So those, all the chapters are important, but those one I think have some very important information that might be worth zooming in on a little bit. So that's kind of the structure. So let's add some commentary on those requirements. Phil, can you kind of walk us through those?
We'll talk through the pillars. So, risk management, a program led by top management. You're very familiar, whether it's in ISO or in other EU regulations. The definition of what they're involving in risk management here is very broad. So, I've listed out some of the categories here. It specifies you need an overall digital operational resilience strategy, which would encompass a lot of continuity planning, different business continuity measures. With respect to security, requires security controls. There's a more detailed technical standard on everything they're looking for there. They're also putting continuous monitoring and maintaining backups and restoration testing within risk management. So, overall, a very, very broad program considering all the elements of operational resilience.
I'm definitely sensing, language that we have seen in ISO 27001, language that we see. ISO 27001 is the security standard, and also ISO 22301, which is business continuity. So whether on purpose or that's just a coincidence, we're definitely seeing some language, similar language from those different frameworks there.
Yeah, so the next pillar is incident reporting. There's a technical standard. So technical standards are the regulations that provide more information on particular elements here, and those all have been issued at this point, I believe. So there's one on incident reporting that defines how criticality should be determined, which then affects your notification timelines. So if you have what's classified as a major incident, then 4 hours from determining that it's a major incident, you need to notify your competent authority of the incident, or in any case, not more than 24 hours after you become aware that there's an incident.
Yeah, which by the way is the most aggressive I think I've seen. Like there's this whole like how will that work? Like what does it mean to determine that it's classified as major? So, I can see inside of an organization, do you hold off on that official determination to buy some time before the 4 hours to give you the full 24? But whether it's 4 hours or 24 hours, those are pretty much the most aggressive I've seen. I mean, typically most of the regulations I've seen have kind of done what the intermediate report is, which is the 72-hour notification. So kind of interesting. They're being pretty aggressive there.
Yeah, you are seeing the transition to phased notification. So there's also guidance on what exactly needs to be provided at first. But to your point, they're definitely looking for more communication more quickly, but also putting, strong standards on being able to determine quickly.
Awesome. Move to the next pillar.
Yeah, threat-led penetration testing. So what the act actually calls out, chapter 4, I believe, is they call it a resilience testing program, which calls for a variety of assessments, your vulnerability scanning, open source scans, source code reviews, and it specifically calls out penetration testing and threat-led penetration testing. So this is an exercise. There's a detailed technical standard on how it should be conducted, but your tester will, it's expected to gather up information on specific real world threats, conduct a red team engagement based on that information. Then once that portion of the engagement is completed, like as they're working with your company as the assessed entity, like conduct a purple team to replay those attacks and understand, the effectiveness of measures based on those initial results.
Yeah, this is something that we talk a lot with our offensive security practice leader is Corey Wolf, and we talk a lot about like the whole universe of penetration testing because there's so many words that people use to describe pen testing. So you have the spectrum of vulnerability scans at the lowest end. You have compliance-based pen testing, to meet the compliance, check the box. I think threat-led penetration testing, other words I've heard to use to describe that would be something like red teaming. So if you're see red team, also continuous penetration testing, which basically is just saying, hey, look, you're working more collaboratively with your penetration testing team to think through what are the likely risks, the attack methodologies, and then threat-led, hence the name, developing a pen test strategy around that, which I know Corey's very happy to hear like that get codified, like some more clarity around what pen testing is. I just want to point out we have some additional thought leadership on threat led pen testing specifically for DORA as well as red teaming that Corey Wolf puts out. So if you guys go to our website or just Google Risk 360 continuous pen testing and red teaming, you can find some of those white papers that we've written. And also Corey does a weekly cybersecurity executive brief. It's only about 10 or 15 minutes every single week where he covers all the breaches from the prior or the major breaches from the prior week. It's just a really good educational resource. So I want to give him a call out because he does a ton of work there. And I think it's a really cool resource directly related to this most recent DORA requirement.
So the last pillar is service provider management or vendor management for your digital supply chain. I wanted to highlight, especially since this just came into force, maintaining a register of your ICT service providers is a top priority for the EU. So they want these submitted because there's a lot of specifics, which we're not going to get into, around regulation for basically centralized critical ICT providers. So certainly can imagine your cloud providers will be in there, but the EU wants to be able to identify concentrations among a certain vendors. So if they obtain this information and see, wow, there's this say payment processor that a ton of there's more specific definition than a ton, but all these companies in the financial sector are using, then that payment provider becomes subject to additional scrutiny under
Yeah, they're
DORA.
trying to find those critical, I guess, points of failure that maybe are hidden otherwise. So it's pretty interesting what they're doing. The other thing is like this is just more doubling down on what everyone already like. One of the biggest burdens in the industry right now is the vendor management piece of it. No matter which side of it you're on. If you're a bank and you're managing 1,000 vendors, that's hugely burdensome. And if you're a vendor and your primary customer are banks and you're just going through audit after audit and answering questionnaire after questionnaire and all these burdensome contractual clauses, well, this is tripling down, I would say. It's already been doubled down. This is tripling down on that same phenomena. So if you're hoping that that would go away or lighten, I mean, that's clearly not the case because I think every regulation, every compliance framework across security, privacy, and AI are all heavily focused on the third party risk management aspect of it, just acknowledging how interconnected we all are. Just prepare for that. I bet there'll be a upswell, in the near term of folks kind of saying, oh, we need to dust off the folks we haven't looked at in a while and go check them out. So you might see an upswing in vendor management activities. So we'll see. So obviously, like regulation is brand new. As of this recording is January 22nd. The regulation became enforced January 17th. So we're only a few days into this thing. So there's a lot we don't know. Phil, walk us through like what are some of the biggest questions on your mind in terms of DORA?
So always the question is, the pace of enforcement. In this case, I've also seen some questions of, who's doing the enforcing. So you have your sectoral authorities, bank supervisors, insurance supervisors. How much bandwidth do they have specifically on the cybersecurity side to add this to their responsibility? And then this is also interesting because the fine and penalty structure is not really defined within the regulation. So there's, as far as I know, no visibility into how large fines might be, what penalties might look like
Yeah,
exactly.
that's quite a bit different from like GDPR and NIST 2, who like specifically defined like percentages of revenue that you could be fined up to. So it's interesting they decided not to do that in this one. I almost wonder because of the emphasis on third party risk management, if they're expecting like some commercial enforcement, like the banks to enforce commercially some requirements. I don't know what they're thinking as that speculation, but it does stand out as a little bit different than what they've done the last few regulations.
Yeah, for sure. It is a different approach. So what I talked about on the last slide with critical ICT providers, those centralized vendors that serve high volume of companies within the industry, who are those, and what's going to be the rigor of oversight for those companies? And then, of course, how compliance will be demonstrated. I know we're going to go into detail on that, but again, like just setting the context, there's no certification really envisioned or mentioned here. Like you said, a lot will be in the supply chain, but what if you're in that supply chain? What does a good answer look like?
All unknowns. That concludes our overview of the framework itself. So I think we want to shift gears a little bit and kind of give you some guidance based on what we're seeing out there in terms of how to achieve compliance. And specifically, like here's some of the assumptions that we're operating off of so you can know where we're coming from. We're basically assuming that anyone that's dealing with DORA or taking it seriously right now, this is not your first compliance framework. You're probably doing a whole slew of them already. You're probably doing SOC 2, ISO 27001. You probably have your own policies and procedures. You're probably thinking about NIST 2 and others already. So the question isn't how do you build a security program? It's how do you integrate, improve compliance to DORA in a program that you already have? And are there any additional things that you need to do? Because we know that compliance is already costly. You're already managing thousands of controls. You're already dealing with all the customer questionnaires and audits, all that kind of stuff. So that's where we think that you're probably operating already. So what we want to do is talk about how do you build a scalable and efficient program? How do you demonstrate DORA compliance by integrating it into your existing compliance program and demonstrating DORA compliance, and really not just DORA compliance, but whatever comes down the pipe next. Because DORA is not the last thing that you will see. There will be additional regulations and compliance requirements and changes. So you need to have a process to integrate that. So what we'll do is we want to give you an approach to think about to integrate DORA into your existing compliance program, and then we want to pull out some of the specific requirements just so you can be aware that hey, this might be a little different. This might be a net new thing that you have to do. So we'll dive into that. I talked about our desired outcomes. So let me just talk about the journey to DORA compliance. So this is kind of our playbook and our roadmap. I hope it gives you words and a thinking model for how you can introduce new compliance requirements into your program. We've helped. I mentioned at the beginning of this is that we've done I think over 2,000 engagements now where we help organizations obtain compliance. And I think the advantage that that has given us is that we've like just seen how it works inside of organizations over and over. What works, what doesn't, what's a repeatable process. And over the course of the last 10 years or so, this is kind of our battle hardened playbook. So what we typically recommend when a new regulation comes out, like DORA, is that you need to do a current state assessment. And what does a current state look like in the context of DORA? I think number one is a risk assessment. And when I say risk assessment, it means things like, how applicable is DORA to you at all? And if it is not applicable, justify your approach in case that's ever scrutinized. If it is applicable, document that. And then think through what a right size program is for you so that you have a defensible approach if customers or vendors or regulators ever come out. That's a documented risk assessment approach. And then assuming that it is applicable to you, you need to do a maturity roadmap. So go through the regulation itself and identify if you have control gaps and things that I would expect to see. Maybe you're doing pen testing, but you're not doing threat led pen testing. Maybe you have to upgrade to red teaming or continuous testing. Maybe you have business continuity, but you don't have a strategy specific to the notification requirements outlined in DORA. Maybe you're doing third-party risk management, but you're not doing it thoroughly enough to defend yourself when it comes to DORA compliance. Maybe leadership has bought in on cybersecurity, but you're not documenting that in a way that would stand up to scrutiny. So again, you need to do that maturity assessment. That's our first step. We do the risk assessment, determine your risk, do a maturity assessment based on that, and then identify the gaps and make a decision on like how much work do we need to do to build a defensible approach, and then go forward and start building that. The second piece of this is harmonizing your program. So like I said, you're probably already doing SOC 2, maybe you're doing ISO, maybe you're compliant with other frameworks. You probably have security compliance policies. So doing a shore up and mapping between what DORA requires and what you're already doing. So for example, if you're doing ISO 27001 and you've adopted all those policies and the management system and the controls, well, you don't want a whole separate parallel set of policies to demonstrate DORA compliance. You want to integrate DORA compliance into your existing policy and control sets in a way that makes sense for your organization. So perform that mapping and that harmonization. At Risk 360, we use our GRC platform Full Circle, where we manage all of our controls, and we might add a tag or some additional language inside those controls to demonstrate DORA compliance. So if you ever wanted to generate a report and say, how compliant am I to DORA, you could evidence that. But whatever that looks like for you, you need to go ahead and map it back to your existing program. And then finally, your third step is you want to implement those new elements. I listed off a couple. So based on your maturity roadmap, maybe you need to do threat-led pen testing, you need to upgrade your BCP, maybe you need to update some policies, your third-party risk management, whatever those things are based on your risk assessment and your maturity assessment, implement them. And then lastly, you need to work to operationalize them. And what I mean by operationalize is, well, you probably had to upgrade your risk assessment process to consider DORA requirements. You probably had to update your third-party risk management process. You probably had to upgrade to threat-led pen testing. Well, that's not a one-time upgrade. That's the new normal. So you need to figure out how you're going to operationalize and maintain those processes over time, either through updated policies, monitoring procedures, internal audits, whatever that looks like for you. And that will become a continuous process for you as you continue your maturity journal. So bottom line is take a screenshot of this. Maybe this will give you some words that if you want to go back and present it to your team and say, hey, look, this is how we want to integrate new frameworks on a go forward basis. This will give you some language to think through that. And we could obviously help you if you want to talk through that or like dive into any of these in specific details. The other thing I just want to point out is a big burden when it comes to these new compliance frameworks is just proving compliance. And who do you need to prove compliance to? And that's often different depending on the organization. But some common things that we see is maybe you have a board of directors or executive team, you're a security leader, a compliance leader. You just need to, like, you do a quarterly information risk council meeting or something, and you want to be able to tell them how you're confident that your organization is compliant with DORA. Obviously, there's regulators. Maybe, hopefully not, but maybe you wind up in litigation and you have to defend your program in a court. You want to be able to do that. And then the most common one that we see is, in those customer contracts or customer questionnaires or during due diligence with a prospect, they want to say, hey, show me what you're doing with your security program. Show me that you're compliant with DORA, because I'm a big bank and you can't do business with me unless you do that. So those are the folks that I start to think about when I'm thinking about proving compliance. And Phil mentioned earlier that there's no official certification or anything for DORA compliance. So how do you prove compliance? What do you do to show your compliance to DORA? Things that we have seen work is building something like a transparency report where you say, hey, here's our approach to DORA compliance, and outlining how you do risk assessments, how you evidence the operational effectiveness of your program. Maybe we call it like a DORA transparency report. You could do something like that. I also think in this case, there's some value in if you're already doing something like ISO 27001 certification or SOC 2 or any framework, is in the DORA transparency report. You can obviously just talk about how you're compliant, but then you could also map it back to how the third-party certification that you got, like ISO or SOC 2, is third-party validation that you are in fact meeting those requirements. And that's a nice enhanced way to prove out compliance and get extra credit, because if you're already going through those certifications, it's a pretty low lift to just pull out those controls and requirements and point them back to how that helps you achieve your DORA compliance. So those are a few things that we think when it comes to proving out compliance. And we're wrapping up here. I think where Phil and I want to close here is just pointing you back to some free resources that we think are valuable, agnostic of framework. So number one, I just want to point you back to YouTube. Go to Risk 360 on YouTube. Check out, we have hundreds of videos on all sorts of compliance frameworks and topics. So if you're a security or GRC nerd out there and you want to dive into some things, lots of resources out there for you there. Same on our website. We have some courses that we've put together, as well as compliance packs just like this for other frameworks that you can download and check out. But specific to DORA compliance, because that is why you're here. Obviously, you have this video. So you can have this video, share it with whoever you want. It's on YouTube. We're also sending it via email, however you got it. But in addition to this email or this video, there is an executive summary. So it's a version of the slide deck where you can hand that to your colleagues or read it for yourself. My favorite piece of content is the markup with comments. So we've actually marked up the regulation. I've mentioned that a few times with Phil or my comments, and they're mostly Phil's comments, and that's who you want to hear from. He's an expert here. And you can think of it as having a partner to read the regulation with, where we're trying to pull out interesting points for you as you read that text. So you can download those 3 things. There's a link in the comment of this video if you'd like to download that, or you can visit our website and you can find it in the white paper section and have that. It's absolutely free. Thank you guys. We appreciate y'all joining us. I hope this was valuable and you feel like you have a handle on DORA compliance. And we'll look forward to talking to you on the next one.